Chapter 26. Wilbur didn't smoke cigarettes that much. The problem began once his mother died, and an instinct became apparent to him, as if the light-headed buzz and corruption of his lungs was his destiny. His fresh air, his removal of the weight on his shoulders, whenever the death inside of his body, the memories and flashes needed a release, this was how. As Wilbur took another long drag of his cigarette, he sunk deeper into his own pit of denial. The hot ash burning the sides of his fingers stopped him from sinking too deep for safe retrieval. Though, that was the question. Did he want to be retrieved? Saved, even? He drove his younger brother of 2 lives away. First Tommy Soot, now Tommy Adele. Just like W. Soot, Wilbur was a fucking monster. The garden at this hour didn't help the bleakness in his head. He sat on the stone patio, the slamming of the front door from Tommy still a fresh wound. His hand hovered over the call contact button on his phone screen, the unconscious part of him shouting for the movement. If he was alone for any longer, he would do far worse than smoke a simple addictive. He winced as another speck of hot ash flared his skin. His finger pressed onto the button by accident. Wilbur sighed and held the phone to his ear. There was no point in stopping the call. "What do you want, Wilbur? I'm driving right now." If relief could be a person, it would be Techno. From his voice alone, the shadows ahead of him in the garden dissipated. Techno. He faltered into the phone. His throat was wrecked from the shouting match earlier and the many tears that followed. He could hear the change of Techno's demeanor over the line. "What's wrong?" There was a silence, and the shadows grew. "I'm almost home right now." The black in the garden faded to an even darker color. There was a single torch on a wall. Chests surrounded him. Mud encased the ceiling. A small, scarred boy shook in front of him, his shoulders quivering and face painted with scrapes and blood. The man, Wilbur, stepped closer to this poor, frail boy. His cackles echoed the broken walls that insulated no heat and instead housed a breeding ground for the cold air and biting winds. "They're lying to us. Tobias? He's lying to you, man!" The person in Wilbur's body hounded onto the boy. As the torchlight flickered, blue eyes and blonde hair shined in the dark. It was Tommy. He would drop us at the second he realizes we're not in the lead anymore. No, stop it!" Tommy shouted. Yet the man wasn't perturbed by the horror in the young boy's eyes. The swarming doubts dulling the blue seemed to push the man on. This was W. Soot. This was him. Tommy's older brother, the man who would pick up the boy as a baby and bounce on his hip when Tommy took his first steps toward him. Not towards his father, but to him. Yet now, this W. Soot stared at Tommy as if he were about to be stabbed in the back by his own blood. Paranoia crippled his once caring soul, and twisted every attachment he once loved to hold close. Water drenched him, soaking through his sweater and dousing his skin. The scent of fire was too close for it to be from the torch. "Wilbur, what the hell?" Techno placed down the water hose and rubbed at the scorch marks on Wilbur's clothes. He was back in the garden, with a burnt hole in his jeans. He must have dropped his cigarette. His exposed skin stung, but he didn't feel the pain. too enwrapped on the fear that he caused in Tommy's eyes. It didn't matter if that wasn't his Tommy, or if he didn't remember being W. Soot, because it was still him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't deny it. Tommy was right. But he shouldn't be right. He can't be, because that would mean he was... Wilbur was a terrorist who killed his own people, blew up his unfinished symphony, and abused his baby brother as lunacy, and all the betrayals he faced took their toll. He never wanted to hurt Tommy, yet here he was, with the shadows of the garden displaying his deepest regrets. He didn't want it to be real. Techno pulled him up from where he sat on the patio and pushed him back inside. He shivered as the ventilated air hit him. A towel landed on his lap and he rushed to hug it around his body. "What's up with you?" Techno asked, eyeing the hole in Wilbur's jeans and stained ash in between his fingers. You didn't even realize it was burning you." Wilbur gripped tighter on the towel, not liking the concern dripping from Techno's voice. "Do you remember what I told you yesterday about me seeing things?" was all Wilbur needed to say, for the deadpan look to leave Techno's face, and urgency to take its place. "Yeah, it's getting worse." Techno moved to sit on the floor in front of Wilbur, and handed him a hairband. He twisted it in his hands, and frowned down at the man. "What?" Huffing, Techno gestured to his dyed hair. "It used to calm me down when we were kids." If the circumstances were different, and a ghost's carefree and transparent laughter wasn't echoing throughout his ears, then Wilbur would have laughed. He braided Techno's hair for the first time when he was 16 years old, not a kid. But he more acted like one compared to his final months aged 16, when the woman who should have been at his secondary school graduation died on that hospital bed. He stopped braiding Techno's hair after that day. Long hair reminded him of something he lost, something he shouldn't mourn when he was just a child. Yet now, as he threaded his fingers through the dyed pink strands and fastened a braid, the pounding in his head calmed, the ghost's laughter dulled. As he gazed at the finished result, his fingers no longer busy, the tremors in his hands returned. Techno shrugged the braid past his shoulder and sat down next to him on the sofa. The same sofa his conversation with Tommy had started. The same place he had betrayed his trust and said such awful fucking things that he didn't even mean. Not even the smallest bit of him believed the words he shouted at the one who was nothing but kind to him. Tommy was the one who convinced him to go to therapy, who opened up that bridge he needed to talk and even think about his mother again. He felt understood with him. And just like with everything, Wilbur decided to ruin it all. "Techno, I fucked up," he said. "I fucked up so badly." Techno frowned and looked closer at him. The dried tear tracks on his face, the festering darkness in his eyes, the shaking in his shoulders. "Where's Tommy?" Techno asked. Wilbur screwed his eyes shut. A whimper left his lips. "He can't be right," he whispered, voice strained. "He can't be." "What did you do?" He couldn't have expected me to believe that shit, Techno. It was true. It was real, but he needed to avoid it. It's bullshit. "Wilbur, what did you do?" Techno repeated, sterner than before. Soft eyes hardened. no longer looking at someone he had sworn to protect and defend the minute the younger boy broke down in his arms on the way to the funeral. "I made Tommy run away," he admitted, his heart constricted at the words he never wanted to say. "He told me something, and it sounds fucking insane, and the things he said..." His eyes fogged, and sulfur attacked his nose. There were fireworks, cries of agony and pain. He held Tommy in his arms, pulling the boy back as he tried to get free. Tommy screamed at him to let him go so he could save his friend, but Wilbur held him tighter. Tobias wasn't worth the risk of his little brother. "Wilbur!" He blinked, and Techno wiped his tears away as the scene faded. "I'm gonna need you to tell me what Tommy said," Techno demanded, serious. "Wilbur, did he mention a curse?" His face paled. The tremors in his hands soared. "How do you know about that?" "That doesn't matter right now. What did he say?" No! How do you know about the curse? Will?" he shouted, gripping onto his shoulders. "What else did he say?" He said the curse was going to kill him on his birthday, and that I was cursed as well," he stuttered out. Techno's head recoiled. Confusion and anger roamed his face. His lip curled into a snarl. "Tommy told you he had 1 day left to live, and you let him leave?" His stomach dropped. Fuck. Tommy had 1 day. It was his birthday tomorrow, and he had 1 fucking day. Wilbur flinched as more tears streamed down his face. He so desperately wanted to sink into denial again, for this reality to disappear. He didn't want to be the cause of Tommy's death. The reason why the person he loved like a younger brother died thinking he was all alone, with no one there who cared about him. Tommy would die abandoned because of him. Because of Wilbur's stupid inability to face up to his own problems and admit that there was something wrong with him. That these things he was seeing weren't hallucinations, but were memories, flashbacks. The person who lifted Wilbur out of the grave he dug for himself was going to die. "Do you know where he is?" Techno asked, his voice still raised and face coated in anger. He shook his head, yearning for the throbbing in his skull to return so he didn't have to think about this. His brother, his baby brother, that he failed in his first life, would die a second time, all because of him. As Wilbur collapsed in on himself, Techno grabbed his phone from his pocket and pressed it against his ear. "Who are you calling?" he croaked out, shivering again, but not from the cold. "Tommy." Techno grunted, scowling at him. "We need to find him." Techno sighed violently as his 4th attempt at calling Tommy failed. He pocketed his phone and clenched his hands into fists. His gaze hounded back on Wilbur. "Wilbur, I swear, if he's already dead." He stopped himself. "Finish your sentence," Wilbur snapped. "Say it." Techno's lips thinned. "Say it!" he yelled. "I fucking know you want to. Do you not think I share the same thoughts, Technoblade?" "I'm not saying it." Techno resigned. He pushed at Techno's chest, tears stinging his eyes. "Fucking say it, you coward, Wilbur," he warned. Though the anger had drained from his voice and fists were unclenched, there was still a flame in his eyes. He wouldn't take Wilbur's shit if he carried on. "You're thinking it though, aren't you?" he continued, desperate for the confrontation in his mind to become a reality. "That this is all my fault, and Tommy's going to die because of— Don't finish that," he ordered, with a threatening tone. Yet it was for Wilbur's own sake. "You know it's true!" Techno gripped Wilbur's hands and shoved them back to his side, but kept them in his grasp. "Don't force your self-pity on me." His grip remained tight as Wilbur fought against it. "Don't make this about yourself right now, because Tommy is out there, alone and upset, in the dead of the night. We need to find him." Wilbur sniffed and hugged his arms around himself. The fight left his cold body and timid acceptance, something so close to withdrawal and departure, replaced the empty slot. The door pushed open, and both of them ran towards it, hoping for a certain blonde boy to be there on the other side. Yet it was only Phil, carrying in shopping bags. Phil frowned at Wilbur's wrecked appearance and placed the bags on the table. "What's wrong?" he asked, securing the towel around Wilbur's shoulders. His teeth chattered. Both Wilbur and Techno glanced at each other, their eyes engaged in a silent conversation only the two of them understood. "We need to talk," Techno said, solemn and firm. As he processed whatever the fuck he was just told, Phil directed them both back into the living room. To put it in the simplest words, Phil was distressed. His newest son, his youngest, was missing and destined to die at midnight. And he had no fucking idea what to do with that information. He couldn't cry or show his distress. At least, not in front of Wilbur and Techno. And even then, he was so tired of grieving. It didn't help that Wilbur looked seconds away from breaking down again after hearing Techno's explanation. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't an expert on Greek mythology or finding missing children. He wasn't fit to be a single father. Kristen was supposed to be here to help deal with this, to be by his side as they consoled their troubled sons and figure it all out. He can't do this alone. The moment that young boy wearing a ratted t-shirt and worn-in jeans showed up at his door with a face full of dare and mischief, Phil knew he was his, that Tommy was one of them. But that once lively face breathed in the night winds, somewhere outside, lost in a world that fated his death. He needed to find him. Techno returned from the upstairs with a ragged book in his hands, the same notebook Phil occasionally saw underneath Tommy's pillows when he changed his bedsheets. "Nikki has told me before that everyone who's cursed has an item that survived their rebirth. This might be Tommy's," Techno explained as he seated himself down on the sofa. That was another thing Phil needed to wrap his head around. Nikki was cursed as well. He didn't get how either of them could keep this burden to themselves and survive years of different lives, memories, and personalities, without a piece of them dying each time. They were so young, too young to be having to deal with any of this. Phil moved to look over his shoulder. Tommy's rushed writing accompanied every page, each with symbols in the right corner of the page. It looks like he treated it like a diary. The two flicked through the notebook. The violent crossing out in black ink worried him. Tommy's irritation bled onto the page. The columns of unanswered myth theories, the paragraphs of analyses and detailed events in his current life overwhelmed Phil. No child should have to do this just to survive. Techno stopped at the page with the written message from W. Soot. Both of them glanced over at Wilbur, who was now asleep on the arm of the sofa. He didn't know what to do with that. He wasn't that well versed with the history of Snowchester and L'Manberg. He barely remembered secondary school and blanked out most of it. But he knew that W. Soot, at the end of it all, wasn't the best man, in terms of his own actions and mental health. Frankly, it frightened Phil that such memories were inside the head of his son. He remembered when Wilbur was a carefree child, how he would force Kristen to take him to the zoo the next town over so he could add more reasons into his little notepad about why anteaters were the worst animal to exist. It was an eccentric list that Phil pinned to the fridge until Wilbur took it down in embarrassment, aged 12. Those were the years before it all went to shit, and he finally understood the burden, the pain of being a single parent. But at least he had Techno's support. As Techno continued to go through the notebook, Phil eyed the very noticeable space on the sofa that normally fit 4 people. Tommy. He needed to find him, and he would, even if it was the last thing he'd ever do. Techno sat up straighter, glaring down at his phone with newfound panic. Nikki texted me back. He announced, Tommy was at her house, but he's not there anymore. His grip on the steering wheel harshened. The rising sun on the horizon taunted him. It was barely 4 o'clock in the morning, yet the sun peeked over his dashboard. Not letting himself be disturbed by nature's ways, Phil drove faster. Where would he be? He asked Techno in the front seat. Nikki's checking the cafe, but she suggested another place. Techno said as he put the location into Phil's phone. Drive there. The place they stopped at didn't ease the hammering of Phil's heart, nor his forming headache. The seawall laid in front of them, next to a lonely bench. It was windy. The breeze struck harsher than usual, strong enough to push an unsteady man. Tommy stood high on the seawall edge. His feet trod lightly along the stone, his steps careless. A breath lodged in Phil's throat as the boy he saw as his own son staggered. He was dangerously close to falling, but Tommy didn't seem to care. He walked forward, shrugging off Techno's shoulder touch as he exited the car. He shouldn't startle Tommy, but he couldn't just sit there helplessly from the car when one rough gust of wind could send the boy tumbling down to the shallow waters. Tommy? He called out, trying not to alarm him. Yet the wind swallowed his voice. Tommy kept his head set straight, gazing into the sun rising in the clouds of orange and soft pinks. Phil moved closer and called out his name again. Tommy turned his head, his eyes as red as the sunrise and tired as the disappearing moon. He was a bad father for not doing anything before. He knew Tommy wasn't like other foster kids, that he had been beaten down until no recovery. Yet there was still life in his eyes, clinging onto a dying flame of hope. He should have kindled that flame sooner. I don't know what I am, Phil. Tommy shuddered, his tone flat. Unlike the months before, there was no desire in his voice. It was hollow. I keep thinking, what if I'm Theseus again? Tommy swayed over the edge. Wouldn't it just be better for me to already seal my fate? Fall for the second time? I don't need anyone to push me this time. Phil's hand cradled the stone seawall as he peered up at Tommy, concern and care in his glassy eyes. If he made one wrong move, if he grabbed Tommy at the wrong time, he would fall. Techno had explained that usually the curse meant that you couldn't die to any circumstances besides the rebirth, but he didn't want to risk it. He stared at the boy who doubted every piece of love that was thrown at him, and tightly smiled. Tommy, I want you to know that I believe you, Phil said. The other stumbled, his words surprising him. Tommy's head lowered. Do you really? Or do you still think that this is me having dreams again? Guilt resided in Phil's face. His shoulders sagged. Even though he knew his initial reaction to Tommy's nightmares and screams of Wilbur being a murderer were valid, appropriate even, it didn't help that the product of his own words resided in front of him. One of his own was so certain that no one else in his family would believe him, and stood staggering over the edge. It was partly his fault. He reduced Tommy's fears and fights with Wilbur to just him acting out. That it was a problem he could figure out himself with his therapist's help. But that wasn't the case. Phil opened his mouth to say anything. Yet Tommy spoke first. You don't have to explain yourself or apologize, Phil. I'm not the best at this either. He sighed, his heart clenched. There wasn't a selfish bone in this boy's body. Even when Phil had hurt him, whether intentionally or not, Tommy went out of his way to make him feel better. No, I should, he protested. It's my job to make sure you're safe and listened to in my house. It's the simplest thing, and I fucked it up. His fists curled on the stone seawall. I let you down. Something flickered across Tommy's face. Something Phil had never seen before, but he wanted it to stay. It brightened his dull eyes for just a moment, relaxed his tense shoulders, and stopped the shaking in his arms. It was hope. Though that same hope died shortly after another gust of wind blew against his body and reminded him of his fate. Tommy smiled sadly at Phil, his arms embracing the cold and moving breeze. You did your best. And if it means anything, you're the best father I've ever had. Phil's chest pounded. He wasn't cut out to deal with this. Tommy, can you get down from me, please? He begged. His voice trembled. A moment passed where neither of them moved. Tommy's eyes stayed fixated on the morning sun. A deep exhale rattled his posture, and he stepped down. Phil rushed to hug him close to his chest. You little shit. His words were sharp, yet endearing. I want you to know that over every life I've lived, I've never felt this happy in these 6 months. Tommy whispered. I just wish I could add longer with you. You will, Phil replied, not allowing his fears to seep into his voice. He carded his fingers through Tommy's hair. He wouldn't describe the feeling flowing through him as relief, because even with him in his arms, it still wasn't okay. It's okay, Phil, Tommy murmured, leaning into his hand. No, it's not. He choked. He clutched him closer as more wind bit at their thin clothes. He wanted the world for Tommy, yet he only had hours. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. Is now a good time to say the engine in the car is still running, or... Techno interrupted. Technoblade, I swear. Phil huffed. Tommy stilled in his arms and let go. He stared at Techno, frowning as if he had just remembered something. Why did Nikki want me to tell you first? He asked, his arm still interlinked with Phil's. Techno walked forward to the seawall. Who do you think helped her figure out her recent myth? He tilted his head with a grin. Daphne was an easy one to guess. So you knew from the start. Tommy said, his gaze indifferent. You knew all along that I was cursed. There was a hint of disdain in his voice, but there was no bite to his tone, just a muffled sadness. I knew the second I saw your tattoo. Techno explained. He fiddled with his hands as he spoke, almost as if he realized the hurt Tommy felt from his secret keeping. Tommy stayed silent for a minute, relishing in his array of emotions and thoughts, things Phil couldn't interpret. The situation was complex, he must admit, since it meant someone would have always believed Tommy if he told Techno first. Then this wouldn't have happened. No unleashed tears, no jarring words, no abandonment nor betrayal. Just acceptance and support. But Greek myths couldn't survive without a few misunderstandings. Techno cleared his throat. I just thought you had until you were 21, like Nikki. But obviously not. Yeah, I was pretty let down in the adult death department. Tommy agreed, sparking a laugh from Techno. Phil rubbed his forehead. The two continued to stare at each other, captured in a silent conversation he had only seen Techno and Wilbur be able to sustain. Though he was mistaken with how neither of them needed to speak to understand their bearings. Techno wanted to wait for Tommy to come to him for help, whilst Tommy never liked admitting his need for it. The two were at a stalemate. Techno reached over and clasped his hand over Tommy's shoulder, glad the other didn't flinch at the touch. Get in the car so I can guess your myth, Tommy. A small smile reached Tommy's lips, a subtle and hesitant one. Techno squeezed his shoulder, and the expression steadied. Phil trailed after them back into the car with one mission on his mind. He would save his son. He couldn't lose someone else he loved. He won't. Once they arrived home, Tommy stayed by Phil's side as Techno volunteered to wake Wilbur up. As the man blearily opened his eyes and sat up, Tommy froze. He was scared of the same person who once provided him with the most safety, the one he thought understood and loved him. The words Wilbur had casually hissed at him, the daunting phrases that followed him everywhere in this life, wouldn't leave his head. He was a liar, a problem no one wanted, someone who shouldn't be trusted, a waste of time no foster family could deal with. Tommy thought this house would be different. And despite the comforting hug from Phil and support from Techno, the waking man on the sofa destroyed it all. At least watching Wilbur be kicked awake amused him. Unease swelled through him as consciousness resided in Wilbur. It hurt less when he was asleep. All right, let's play Guess Who then, Techno announced with a clap of his hands. He rolled his eyes, but appreciated the use of humor during this time. If everyone in this household stared at him as if he were a broken being, then he would fucking lose it. He kept avoiding Wilbur's eye as he told Techno the pages in his notebook that talked about his current life events. He sought no need for confirmation in what swam in those brown eyes, whether it was guilt or still the same disgust that glared at him as Wilbur held him against the wall hours earlier. Yet the look he received from Phil was no better. A remorseful glow of deep regret. He preferred the normalcy Techno offered. Tommy, I'm gonna need more than that, Techno said after Tommy explained his first major fostering home. The adulterous family vloggers who exploited children. Even you acknowledge in your notebook that the themes of child death and betrayal are popular and generic themes in Greek myths. His tattoo began to burn. The mark of Zagreus seemed to blacken even darker. He sighed and rubbed his wrist. I know. Techno, I know. Phil placed his arm around him, and Tommy stopped himself from shrugging off the touch. Phil needed it more than him. He shut his eyes for a moment, trying to ignore the pain. What about the void? Do you have notes on that? Techno asked, oblivious to Tommy's agony. It's one of the beginning pages. I have an entire file of every dream visit. He explained, his teeth gritted Dream visits? Someone asked. The voices merged. He couldn't tell the difference. Like in your dreams, or? No, like dream. Capital D. He's the guy who cursed us all. He spat out. Zagreus. The pain spiked at his name. His surroundings muffled, combining sounds with sights, and every shape dripped to the floor. He screwed his eyes shut, gripping at his wrist. Tommy? It was all too much. The loamy air, the heat from the kitchen, the stares from everyone around him that he could just feel without even seeing. Even the tightness of his thin clothing. He couldn't handle this. He wasn't cut out for this. He shouldn't have to witness his family each deal with their own reactions to his upcoming death. With Wilbur's probable self-deprecation and guilt, Phil's savoring touches and unbearable pity, and Techno's endless questions and pestering. Their stages of foreboding grief. Shut the fuck up! He seethed, eyes locking to the sinking floor. He couldn't even hear himself. He bit on his tongue. Iron tasted in his mouth, and someone picked him up. Get the hell off me! He shouted, scratching at the hands. Everything was just so sensitive. Every patch of his skin stung. Get off me! The hands dragged him upstairs, not deterred by his kicks and clawing. They placed him down on a soft surface. The walls were a blank color, mounted with bookcases. He was in Techno's room. As he gripped at his wrist, the throbbing ceased. His eyes could blink without the shapes blending into different ones. Techno shoved a glass of water into his lap. He stared down at the mug. The scene was weirdly familiar, and probably was because this had happened before, with Techno separating him from the environment that overwhelmed him and calming him down in his room. Just like that one night with Wilbur and Phil in the garden, all those months ago. He sipped on the water, it soothing his dry mouth. I would offer you to watch me play Bed Wars, but I don't think we can do that this time. Techno said, his voice quieter than before at the dining table. Tommy cleared his throat. I think it's appropriate for you to continue your Bed Wars streak whilst I'm on my deathbed. I can easily take back my favorite mug. No, it's mine. Techno shook his head with a grin. Tommy grabbed Steve, the polar bear plushie, from his bed and rested it in his lap, only for Techno to reach forward and snatch it off him. You can't have him. You dare deny the wishes of a dying child. He joked, though it brought back the cruel reminder. Techno fiddled with Steve's ears, the fluffy texture calming him. You're not going to die, Tommy. He began, earnestly. We have until midnight, and I'm a fast reader with your notebook. You said you've put in details about your dream visits, so maybe that's involved in your myth. He nodded, still glaring at the polar bear in Techno's arms. The other sighed and threw it at him. Thank you, Tommy mumbled, hugging the polar bear close. For everything. He didn't want to leave. Not yet. Thank me when I save you, Techno said. A knock came from the door, and Phil entered the room, hesitancy written all over him. You two doing all right? He asked, and they nodded. Techno patted both Steve and Tommy before opening the door. I'll be in your office, Phil. Phil replaced where Techno sat before, and stared at Tommy, uncertain, with his hands clasped together. It looked like he was psyching himself up to speak, so Tommy stayed quiet. His speech faltered and he sighed. We've got Techno going through your notebook, okay? You'll figure it out. You'll get to blow out those candles on that stupid cake I ordered last week. You'll be 16 in this life, Tommy. For more than a second. I hope so, he replied. Wait, you got me a cake? Of course I did. What kind? A marble cake? Phil answered with a half-hearted smile. Tommy chuckled into the polar bear. Was that to spite Wilbur? Partly, he admitted. Wilbur's still downstairs if you want to speak to him. Tommy was unsure if he wanted to. A conversation with the person who practically sent him away and almost made him jump from that seawall was not one he longed for. But he needed to. Today was not a time to avoid things because there wasn't much time left. He reluctantly got up from Techno's bed and nestled Steve back into his normal place by the pillows. Fine. But if he says any other shit he said earlier, I'm gonna deck him, he said. Permission granted. The walk downstairs was pitiful. He slowly trod on each step, scouting out where the creaks normally came from so his journey continued in silence. He wouldn't say he was delaying this conversation, but he 100% was. He sat down in the living room on the other end of the sofa from Wilbur. The man had one of the fact files of possible Greek myths he could be in his hands. Perseus laid in his touch. Ironic. The denier of a happy ending held it in his grip. Wilbur looked up from the paper. His eyes weren't tainted by anger or disgust, as he imagined, but with levels of guilt he couldn't digest. Swirls of regret, shame, and remorse mixed in blends of brown. His eyebrows were downturned, conflicted. Tear tracks stained his face. If the words, "I'm sorry," leave your mouth, I'm punching you, Tommy said, lowly. He'd had enough apologies for today. Enough considerate speeches and insufferable goodbyes. I am, though, Wilbur whimpered. There was nothing in his voice that spoke Wilbur to him. It was vacant and dead. The shell of a person sat beside him, no longer living inside of it. Punch me, then. I deserve it. Oh, enough with this fucking sad boy hours bullshit, Wilbur, he scorned, glaring at him. He exhaled and tried to relax his shoulders. He didn't come here for a fight. He needed answers. Did you mean it? Wilbur frowned at him. What you said earlier. Did you mean it? With his back hunched, more shame seeped into his face. His bottom lip trembled as he shook his head. I didn't mean it, Tommy. Any of it, you... He stopped himself and moved closer. Their shoulders partially touched. For a moment, adoration took his eyes as he stared at Tommy. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Tommy. You broke down my walls. You tried to help me when I forced everyone else to give up on me. Tommy's chest constricted. I trust you. And I always have. Nothing will break that trust. Wilbur whispered. I love you, okay? Nothing will change that. As his words mended the hurtful phrases that kept resonating in Tommy's mind, he surged forward and wrapped his arms around his brother. His brother. He didn't care anymore. He didn't care that this was W-Soot. That Wilbur had hurt him so many times, and not only in this life, but in two of them. Because the Wilbur in front of him, the man in his arms and crying into his shoulder, was better. He was light, the sun, everything Tommy envied and treasured. His voice could send him to sleep on a restless night. His laughter could brighten up any room. Their little jokes back and forth improved his mood no matter the circumstances. This was Wilbur. He gripped tightly at Wilbur's shoulders, his ears brushing past them as he tried to drown out his own guilt. Wilbur wasn't the only one to say something hurtful that night. "I didn't mean it. Please, I didn't mean it." He sobbed into his neck, searching for the warmth that Wilbur always radiated. "Mean what? You're not the reason your little brother dies for a second time," he recited, sorrow bleeding into his voice. You may be, W. said, but I... His throat closed up as tears streamed down his face. "Tom's," Wilbur whispered kindly, his thumb stroking Tommy's back. "I don't know the extent to what he did to what I did to you, but I swear, I won't fail you now." He relished in his comfort, wanting nothing more than to be closer to him, even if it wasn't possible. "Do you remember?" He hesitated to ask. "Bits and pieces." Wilbur brushed the wisps of hair off Tommy's forehead. "Do you remember how you used to sing to the flowers in the garden to help them grow?" A breathless chuckle sweetened the air. "I put fertilizer in the yellow roses, and you were convinced the new growth was because of your singing. I didn't have the heart at the time to correct you." Tommy giggled. "What about the drug van?" "It was never a drug van!" he exclaimed, laughing with him. Reminiscing on the days before wars and heartbreak were bittersweet, but necessary. Those were times where brotherhood wasn't corrupted and youth, innocence, still lingered. No need for soldiers or swords attached to their sides. Just a splintered family trying their best with what they had. But, just with everything good in Tommy's life, the moment had to be ruined. The pain in his wrist returned. Yet it spread to the rest of his body before he could even look down at the tattoo. He crumbled over, recognizing such soreness and discomfort. But this was too soon. It shouldn't be happening yet. He broke away from Wilbur's arms, whimpers tumbling out of his mouth as aching bore into his skin and boiled his insides. "Tommy?" Wilbur said, worried. He jumped up from the sofa and ran into the kitchen. He picked up the knife from the counter. Tommy needed to know if this was the reason why. If the pain was because of that. Without hesitation, he cut into his hand, and gold blood poured out of the wound. Dread settled deep into his boiling stomach. Wilbur sped into the kitchen and gasped at the sight. He crumbled to the floor. The knife rattled beside him. Wilbur rushed to hold him, not letting his head hit the hard surface. What does that mean?" he asked, panicked. Why the fuck are you bleeding gold?" Tommy bit down on his cheek, squirming as the blood dripped onto the floor and mixed with pigments of red and gold. "It's too soon for this. I don't know why." His breathing quickened. His chest pounded too loudly for him to even think. He caught the time on the clock. It was 5 to 7 in the morning, not even close to midnight. "Wilbur," he croaked out. "I don't have much time left." His hands shook as he cradled Tommy to his chest. "If you fucking leave me, I swear." He sniffed, and cries wrecked his throat. "Please don't leave me," he whispered as he kissed his forehead. "I don't understand. I should have longer," he muttered, his voice frail. His blood heated under his skin, burning every nerve in his body. His lungs caved in on themselves, making it harder to speak. "Dad!" Wilbur screamed out. "Dad, Techno, get in here!" "It's okay. he faltered, his lips trembling and drenched in blood. It was okay. 6 months made up for a lifetime of loneliness and isolation. Moments with Techno and Phil watching shows they loved. The concerts Wilbur performed in his bedroom. The meals at the dinner table filled with back-and-forth laughter. Annoying Ronbu in science classes and teasing Tubbo in music. It was all worth it. He could never replace them. All he wanted was a family, and they were his. Wilbur sobbed. No! None of this is fucking okay. You're supposed to live, Tommy. I don't want you to die. His chest heaved. Please don't die on me. His bloodied lips twisted into a sad smile. I don't think I have a choice in that. And I never have. The kitchen door burst open, and 2 figures dashed into the room. One full of life and answers. I figured it out. I figured it... Techno trailed off. His voice hitched. Both Phil and Techno fell to Tommy's side. The notebook laid long forgotten in a pool of blood. Techno. He coughed out, leaning into Phil's hands that gripped at his face. He was fine. He was completely fine. At least he wouldn't die alone. Peace flushed through him, the pain disrupted by the family next to him. No, Tommy, I know what your myth is, Techno said, strained. Please. Her spoken name broke the ringing in his ears. As a father mourned his youngest, and brothers held their own, Tommy succumbed to the inevitable. He was back there, in the void. No maze walls adorned with vines, no ships cast upon the sea, no islands at his reach. It was black, empty. Dream stood in front of him, his face open with misery and despair. This time, unlike the first in this life, the unmasked man didn't smile. Instead, he cried. You were Ariadne.